Please welcome Thando Hopa.
Dumelang Sanbonani, greetings. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a story. Now, in the 1940s, two American doctors conducted an experiment known as the doll test. The scientists wanted to understand the impact of racial segregation and discrimination on African American children. So the test was quite simple. Kindergartners were called in and shown two dolls that looked exactly the same. Then, apart from the doll color, apologies, then they were asked to identify the dolls according to their racial perception. So one doll was identified as the white doll and the other doll was identified as the black doll. Then the children were asked questions that went something like this. Which doll is pretty? Which doll is ugly? Which doll is good? And which doll is mean? Now, the children, despite their race, assigned negative attributes to the black doll and positive attributes to the white doll. Now, the questions went along this vein until the children were asked the question that brought us back to the impact of the study, and that is, which doll looks more like you? Now, as I watched footage of this experiment, I paused because two observations ran through my mind. The first was the heartbreaking expressions on the faces of African American children as they painfully reached for the doll that looked more like them. It was the doll that they, and most other children, perceived to be ugly, bad, and mean. The black doll, the same doll that I identify with as a black woman. Now, the second observation arose instinctively, and that is, there were no African American children with albinism among the children who were being interviewed. So I started wondering how I would have responded if I was one of those children. Now, I said I identify with the black doll, yes, but that is mainly because it embodied my experience. But I was also quite aware that the white doll resembled my appearance as a person with albinism. Now, this particular experiment made me introspect on the two cultural and historical forms of racial discrimination merged into my one body, my blackness in terms of race, and my albinism in terms of color. This would mean that African American children would be born within the intersection of race and albinism, placing them in a world between worlds. Growing up in South Africa, my community was filled with diverse people of color, and I remember that when I was about 6 years old, I viewed my first day of school as this exciting adventure. However, like most children who are considered different in one way or another, school became an initiation ground. Because I was the only person in my school who did not have brown skin. And not only that, the lack of pigmentation that ran through my body, including my eyes, resulted in me being legally blind. So the set of circumstances that my body found itself in was met with antagonism from some of my peers and from some adults. I grew to find out that there was a whole institution culturally created about my existence, from derogatory names in almost all indigenous sub-Saharan African languages, to a formalized English term, and I'm sure you've heard of it, albino. Now, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the term albino means a person or animal with a congenital absence of pigment in the skin and hair, which are white, and eyes, which are usually pink. Now, apart from me having other issues with that definition, as a black person, I have in my racial history a sore spot that is reignited whenever my existence is described in the same wavelength as you would an animal. Albinism is no different for me. So, for clarity, my preferred terminology is person with albinism, not albino. But the plot does thicken for albinism, because in certain contexts, it's been subjected to superstitious beliefs, to negative scientific interpretations that label and describe its existence as a genetic disease or a congenital disorder, to cinematic misrepresentations that portrayed it as evil or as a freak of nature, and almost no representation in the beauty economy at the time. So as a young woman, I was living in a culture that was built up to dismiss, marginalize, and discriminate against my kind of human experience. Albinism was culturally created to being an institutionalized other. Now, all this socially constructed madness taught me that we as a society struggle to see difference as part of human diversity. Fast forward to 2012. Now I meet fashion designer Gert Johan Kadzia, and he requests me to model for a photo shoot. Now, at this point in my life, I thought this was preposterous because I was a full-time lawyer slash prosecutor. And then eventually I had this conversation with my sister, and it took some convincing. But I eventually reached out to Gert and I said, all right, I will do this modeling thing, provided that we represent albinism in a positive way. Now, I was about to embark on a journey that would expose what an oversimplification this statement actually was. Now, I did this wonderful project with Gert, but the interest that the project generated from different industry players began an uphill path of representation for me. 2013, I do a shoot with Forbes Life magazine, and actually, this shoot documented a hallmark decision in my media career, and that was to present my eyebrows and eyelashes as pale, believe it or not. Now, previously, I had always altered my appearance by darkening my brows and eyelashes, but this was just how I presented my beauty to the world. But do note that the image of Black albinism with its unique biological traits was not usually celebrated in any beauty culture. So this particular decision was accompanied with mounting self-doubt. So I gradually pursued my new appearance, but I was met with some resistance in industry corridors. So the behind-the-scenes advice went something like this. Oh, but honey, you have to put mascara on your lashes and darken your brows, or else your face is gonna disappear, sweetie. Or how, I thought you said you were done with your makeup. Did you forget your eyebrows? Now, honestly, I was just trying to look like myself. I was trying to embrace the unique characteristics that 500,000 people across the world are born with. But it seemed that with the upcoming new world of diversity, old ideas still persevered in the dominant culture. And I started feeling like I was unnecessarily choosing a harder road. Now, interestingly, albinism was not the only representation that affected me, because race, gender, and nation would remind me of their history of representational harm in media. Now, Black people, women, and Africans are still warding off the impact of harmful representation in media that they didn't even have equal control over. The representation expresses itself in our popular culture through negative stereotypes, objectification, and/or misrepresentation that communicates social inferiority. So my albinism, my Blackness, my womanhood, and my Africanness would make the question of who I represent quite a politically loaded affair. My body attracted scenarios that consistently reminded me that I carry more than just one identity. And my in front of the camera image was usually accomplished after maneuvering microaggressions and stereotypes, not just about albinism, but about race, gender, and nation too. Example, race. Oh, we would love to sign you, but you'd look more accessible with like a long brown weave. Or, is it possible for us to make her lips look smaller? Now, the nuanced attacks that I received were not just limited to race, because being a woman came with its own set of challenges. Gender. Relax. He's just asking you to put on nipple pasties for the shoot. I mean, you're going to seriously have to stop being so conservative. Now, to be clear, female sensuality and sexuality are to be celebrated, but from a place of bodily sovereignty and bodily agency, not from a place of expectation or obligation. Next, Africa. Could you tell us about some of the albino killings in Africa? And what about the superstitions and myths the Africans have about albinos? Now, I would read about Africa as if it is one big country, not a continent with complexity and variation. I was consistently asked the same questions to confirm the same narrative indiscriminately without much credence given to context. I felt as though the much needed albinism awareness was being invaded by an enduring stereotype of what Africa is singularly understood to be: a place of fear, violence, struggle, and witchcraft, overlooking balancing narratives that focus on family, community, progress, and culture. The environment seemed to be closing in on me. because it was not ready to receive or adapt to difference, not in content or in form. I felt like there were just too many stereotypes and prejudices to counter, and too much racial and gendered history that was playing out in the commonplace activities in my career. Now, as a Black African woman with albinism, my very existence attracts social and political consequences, and all of it is significant for me. It is my world between worlds. In the same way I could not just pick one doll, I cannot just pick one identity. An inclusive culture accepts that it is not this or that. It is this and that. The combination of our many worlds is a cultural resource. And I've learned through my experiences that we are a product of culture. We are a result of all the cultural constructs and narratives projected onto our bodies. However, we do have the power to reshape these narratives and become producers of culture. Now, I've learned to use my multiplicity as a cultural asset, in that I choose projects that give me various access points to humanity through my multiple identities. And I find that collaborations that allow for consultation, shared control over representation, co-creation, authenticity, and allow for an embracing of multifacetedness, these projects leave an undeniable cultural footprint, but also they bring us closer to inclusive narratives and cultural reform. Now, some of the personal anecdotes that I would love to share with you on projects that I feel helped reshape culture, but also helped me explore the concept of inclusive representation are Audi Q2 Untaggable campaign partnering with Ogilvy. Now, this was an award-winning campaign that challenged stereotypes and singular identity myths. Next is the Pirelli calendar, created global discourse on race and representation through the adaptation of Alice in Wonderland. Next is Vogue, made history in terms of albinism and representation, but it simultaneously celebrated African luxury. Now, the gap that I inhabited in the doll test reminded me that there is always a world between worlds, and that an unseen existence does not equate to an absent existence. And the reminder manifested through a trying but informative media period that taught me that an absence in representation does not translate to an absence of life, of talent, of complexity, and of value. The more we commit to responsibly accessing one another's humanity by redesigning cultural environments and narratives to being more inclusive, then the better our chances are in building an expansive cultural economy, but also building a future that dares to be large enough to see all of us participate in it. Thank you.